an original.
From Story Studio Network.
I'm Tom Hoppe, and I'm your host of the Most Painful Podcast. On our last episode, we spoke with Dr. Christine Correll, a professor at the University of British Columbia, about insomnia and chronic pain. Now, she shared some very powerful insights to help you get a good night's sleep when you're living with chronic pain. If you missed the conversation, you can find it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And be sure to subscribe so you never miss the latest episode. Today I'm joined by Dr. Umair Majid, a researcher at the University of Toronto, to talk to us about the impact of identity and military mindset on chronic pain. Now, in transparency, I've worked on this research with him. We talked a little bit about it in some past episodes, but now some new stuff has come out, and I want to dive into it. Umair, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Tom. Glad to be on the show. Thanks for the introduction as well. Really looking forward to this conversation, really talking about this exciting topic of military identity and mindset, and really sharing some of the work that we worked on together. So happy to get into it. Take your lead.
Yeah, I found it pretty exciting too, and especially when we get into, I like to coin the thing, the unknown deep-rooted behaviors. But let's start off. I mean, you said we had a couple trajectories, so maybe we can start with that, and I'll let you begin.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for that. I think before getting into the trajectories, I wanted to provide just a bit of context on the study and what we really did, and sort of why we kind of approached the idea and the concepts of military identity and mindset. So our goal was to understand military identity change and how it shifts when chronic pain kind of enters the picture of a military life. And more specifically, tracing how identity might change depending upon the way chronic pain emerges, which brings us to, the three trajectories that you mentioned, which we'll discuss. And second, really understanding the role of having chronic pain and what that plays in the process in recognizing what service members go through identity change when they leave the military, when they're during the transition and during their service. So this was a narrative inquiry study, and what I mean by that, it is a storytelling research method. We spent nearly 2 hours with each veteran. We listened to their entire full story, and from those conversations, we kind of develop a 3-page narrative, kind of like a biography, capturing their experiences related to military identity and chronic pain, before service, when they entered service, during service, when they were leaving service, and into their veteran civilian life. We met again at about an hour and a half, a few months later for about an hour and a half to go deeper and really talk about identity and working together to develop digital stories. So that's a bit about the study itself. In terms of the three trajectories, we'll unpack each of them in turn, but three really basic labels. One is, the first trajectory is kind of like the most intuitive one, where a veteran or a military service member, has a traumatic injury, and the traumatic injury is so severe that it leads to an immediate discharge. And really, I want the audience to think of this as kind of like in our papers, we kind of use the rope as a metaphor. And if you think of a rope of any length, this trajectory is really that rope being cut in half. And that's the image I want you to hold for this trajectory. The second trajectory is what we labeled as a misdiagnosed or a non-traumatic injury. So it is an injury, it is documented, but the veteran or the service member can somewhat continue functioning, and that functioning gets harder and harder over time because, of course, they're not getting appropriate care, and that leads to a delayed discharge 5-10 years down the line, but they continue to serve. And I want the audience to think of this rope as not necessarily a cut in half, but the same length of the rope that kind of starts to split part way through, but not fully, and slowly splits over time. And the final trajectory is what we talked about was cumulative wear and tear and how that leads to gradual discharge. So this was an interesting trajectory because there was a third of our veterans who said that there was no actual injury that led to their chronic pain, no need for going for healthcare, but their chronic pain did develop, and that eventually led them to a delayed discharge, but very much down the line. They continued to function. They took pain relief and muscle relaxant to be able to continue to serve. And this is what I want the audience to think of this as the same length of rope, But instead of being cut in half, like the first trajectory, or being split partway through, kind of think of it as fraying throughout the rope, slowly, fiber by fiber, until at one point it kind of gives and it lets loose. So those are 3 trajectories.
Those are important when we talk about it. And we do have a large non-veteran audience. So someone may ask, why is this different? What's the difference here between, a civilian having chronic pain and a military member having chronic pain? And I've been asked this a number of times by psychologists who work in pain clinics and saying, we have people who are in a car accident or they get injured at work. So why is it different? I mean, did anything come out? I mean, you did all the interviews. Did anything come to your mind that would set that apart from, say, a civilian getting injury and chronic pain versus a military member getting chronic pain or injuries?
Yeah, and it's such a good question. And we've had a couple of these conversations as well. And I think that the trajectories specifically for service member are so important because of how their military identity and mindset are developed and how ingrained they become as a result of their service. Now, I know there's a lot of non-veteran audience here, but I'm sure there's a lot of veteran audience here. So they would find this familiar that, going into the military, a lot of veterans in our study kind of sort of spoke about how they're kind of broken down, and a lot of them joined when at their young age. They're kind of broken down, their identity from civilian life is kind of stripped away, and then they're rebuilt back up with that military identity, with that mindset of mission first, all else. And that becomes so ingrained because a lot of service members, military is their entire life and more, for many years and often many decades. So when they experience chronic pain, then they have to deal with aspects of the military identity and military lifestyle and mindset that are kind of opposing. And that really causes them a lot of issues with military identity and causes it a lot of dissonance. So when it comes to the discharge or the release phase, military identity and mindset is quite a bit contested. So in the first trajectory, for example, with immediate discharge, they have this vision that I'm going to serve for decades and decades more until I retire at the age of 60, whatever it is. But chronic pain or results, the injury results, and that vision, that purpose that they're envisioning is severed. And that purpose is very much tied to how ingrained their military identity and mindset is to their everyday life. That's what makes it so different from them, from civilian life.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to add to that too. When I'm doing talks, I'll say that you have to picture is that you're, someone who joins the military is actually being, in a sense, removed from society, and they're, they are the ones who change versus, say, their friends and family when they go back home and they realize, well, why is everybody different? They're not different. We are different. And I think that, you talk about when someone leaves the service, there's a military identity, but just for our audience to understand too, is, I would suggest somebody who may be in a car accident, granted, they would be losing, possibly, say, could lose their job, which their identity is tied to. I think we all have that. But I would suggest that the extra layer for a military person is they're not just losing their work identity, if we want to call it that, but they're also having to reintegrate back into a society where the value structure is different. So they have another layer that they need to work through, I would suggest. So, I think you've seen some of that in the interviews that you did.
Yeah, totally. And I'll add a bit of a different dimension here in the sense that the way this point that you just raised was really reinforced is by looking at a subgroup of veterans we had who were reservists and part-time reservists. And in the sense that those part-time reservists, they had their own challenges that we can talk about as well. But in terms of identity, their lifestyle, because of the nature of being part-time, they were connected to some degree with civilian life throughout their service. So maybe a couple of days a week they were in military, but a couple of days a week they were out working another particular job or with family or with other sort of individuals. To those people, I felt, and this is a qualitative, I don't have numbers on, but I felt those people, the challenge they face with regards to military identity when they left service completely didn't seem as intense as those that had military service the sole sort of focus of their entire life, and particularly for those that were in military service for decades, really reinforcing the point that military identity is really built at the very beginning, usually in formative young years, and reinforced constantly, that it becomes so ingrained with everything they do.
Yeah, and I think what I took away from this too is that we talk identity, we talk mindset, and there's you and I have had those discussions offline before, and I think that's what I'm picking out of this is what's really, if we look at chronic pain, and even if someone's going through an interdisciplinary pain clinic, and they're mixed in with civilian members. Not the challenge, but I think the difference is really that mindset that has become so normalized that the veteran doesn't even realize that they've changed. And I mean, there's many examples that we can use for that. And it's even to the point where clinicians will say, "Hey, how do I deal with a veteran just telling him to slow down him or her to slow down on a treadmill so they don't injure themselves?" And they feel like they're failing because they've been taught to push through, because one cannot quit in the middle of a war. So this is a mentality. So I found that very interesting when I'm looking through the transcripts from the interviews, that deep-rooted behavior, I think, really has kind of a grasp on people as they're trying to move through this chronic pain issue.
Yeah, I would love, this is a great point, because I pulled out a couple of quotes from veterans that I think illustrate this point much better than I ever could, that if I'm allowed to share.
Yeah, go ahead.
One veteran from the infantry, basically, and the high-ranking veteran, basically said, "Military people don't bitch and complain because I was taught that pain is nature's way of telling you you're still alive. Don't argue with it, suck it up, get on, and capture the objective. That's what the infantry does, so you just do that. You self-medicate out of the wazoo and carry on." I mean, that quote always, whenever I think about military identity and chronic pain and how ingrained it is and influences their behaviors, that's the quote that comes to mind.
Yeah, and we hear that a lot. And because, I mean, we are, or maybe we're not, but I mean, it just comes back to this comparison. I get it quite often. I get this, I said this before, I get this question of why is it different with us? We have to push through, we have to do that. I think the difference is, I would suggest, and I'd like to hear your point on that, is one, the safety net is not there. If you're in the middle of a battlefield, you can't just stop and decide to, take time out. There's no really way to, a person has to be self-sufficient, has to just push through and get the job done because it is life or death. That is maybe a little more dramatic, but that's the reality of it. Versus, if we look at other similar jobs, they have opportunities to pull back from that environment. They have opportunities to, they're not going to be 2, 3, or a month away from home in the field. They're going to have that opportunity to go back. So I just see that as some of the differences there when we talk about chronic pain. And I mean, what's your thoughts on that? If veterans aren't aware of this, or even clinicians are not aware of this, then that could impact on how someone's approaching chronic pain treatments, or how their understanding of chronic pain, and how because if a person's not integrating back into civilian life, they're struggling because they have no purpose. They've lost, the mindset's impacting them. And then they've always been taught to push through. That can be a negative impact on treatment. Do you agree?
Yeah, totally. I think this is such a great point. And I think the point you raised about the difference being that there's no safety net for service members may seem like a minor technicality for some audience member, but I think the study that we did really showed how it impacts every aspect of their daily life. Now, what I would say that not having a safety net makes the mindset and identity of mission first not just so ingrained in every aspect of life, but so enduring and sustainable in every aspect of life beyond military service. So if, I'm going to use the rope analogy because I don't want to introduce more analogies. Think of like the rope as a series of identities of a particular person. Now, for a civilian who is very attached to their work, for example, me, I'm not a military serviceman, not a veteran. I'm a civilian, very attached to my, very close to my identity. That rope might be really strong. So if whatever, I get an injury or chronic pain that affects my ability to do my work, then that rope weakens and that affects my identity. For a military service member, that rope is the strongest, I believe, out of all these different groups because it's so ingrained how it develops, when it develops, and how much it continues to impact them even much later into life, despite, even recognizing. We spoke to many veterans who recognize that, listening to small talk in civilian life really frustrated them, and they recognize that it's frustrating them, but it still frustrated them. It still made them sweat. It still made them angry, right? Because it's so ingrained and it's so enduring, and that's the thing that I think does not exist to the same degree as it does for other groups.
Yeah, when I'm saying these things, I don't want them to sound like they're negative. They're actually positive. There are, as I say to veterans, draw on the strength and differences. So resilience. I mean, we talk about teaching veterans resilience. Veterans know resilience. We just have to sometimes refocus that a little bit, I would suggest. And it also comes down to the family. We've seen that with research with Melanie Knoll, where we look at how it's impacting, that resilience is trickling down to the children, but so is also the issues of chronic pain. And I do agree with, I've talked to veterans who are 80 years old and simply saying we've changed versus, the civilian world changed. They're like, geez, I never thought of that. And I'm 80. And they still hold those memories of the military very tight as if it was yesterday. So, but I think where the struggles sometimes come in, and it'd be good to get your comments on this as well too, is, we talk about the value system. Because in the military, the value system is, mission first, team is big because you really need to rely on a partner that's going to support you. Where I would suggest, in the civilian workplace, there's more of an individualism, and I think this is where those clash of values sometimes happen with veterans unknowingly. Sometimes, veterans will say, "Oh, I got frustrated because the guy parked on the grass and on the curb and didn't care about anybody else but himself." Well, I asked the veteran, why do you think you're feeling that way? I mean, that's the way things are done. But I think these clashes of values sometimes impact the transition piece, which then, of course, trickles down into chronic pain. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the clash of values is such an interesting topic. One of the things we did in the second round of interviews is focus on specifically that. So we specifically asked, for example, do you feel that there's a push or pull from the veteran side? Do you feel a push and pull from the civilian side? And we even asked them to consider like a triangle where each corner is either their military self, their veteran self as they see today, and their civilian self if they see them at all. And we asked them to kind of rate themselves along that. And in our conversations, they were all over the place. There's no consistent, which is kind of intuitive. There's no consistent, all veterans place them in a specific, and all veterans didn't place them on one side. They kind of placed them a little bit military, a little bit veteran self, and a little bit civilian self. And then we also asked them, like, do they envision this changing? And they said all kinds of things, but really ranging that, even though they're starting to understand, starting to adjust to civilian life a lot more, there's still that barrier that remains that civilians will not understand, and they have a hard time adjusting. And because it's so ingrained, military mindset and identity are so ingrained that there'll still be a wall that will prevent them from fully being a civilian or considering themselves a civilian, which is not a bad thing. I think these are part of identities. I think identities can be multiple. There can still be a veteran identity and a military identity and a civilian identity, but it's just to show that the clash of values that you're talking about continue to persist as a part of this identity conversation well into late veteran life.
Yeah, and I agree with that because, I mean, it's almost like we can't close the book on our military identity and think we're going to create a new one. It's going to be there. So I always say draw on the strength and differences and what's different. How do we move forward and what provides us, those strength. just something simple as showing up on time and being a team player. That's a strength. But we don't have to be there 20 minutes early. And the military members who are in the audience will understand that one. So we talked. So those are the kind of the one research, and then you talked about some the trajectories, but also you did another one too, right, with the digitalized stories. Maybe you can just touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, of course. Happy to touch on that. So, of course, this project was multi-year, and there was many different parts of it. One of the things that we set out to do at the very beginning was to really emphasize is this is not just another narrative inquiry research study where we're just publishing a paper about stories of veterans and military identity, because that has been done to some degree. Maybe not to the depth we did, but it has been done to some degree. What we wanted to do is we want to take it to the next level, because the major gap that we see is civilians and policymakers and researchers and clinicians, kind of like what you said in the beginning, Tom, don't fully appreciate or understand how ingrained military identity and mindset are. And then so we thought, what's the best way to communicate some of these really insightful and deep lived and living experiences of veterans about military identity and mindset. So we wanted to take their stories because we spent so much time with them, and we wanted to convert them into digital stories. So kind of think of them as quotes that I kind of like shared a quote with you, but from veterans' own words, from their own sort of using their own tone, their own facial expressions, and talking as if, so I'm not sort of saying what they're feeling about military identity, but they're saying it themselves. Mm-hmm. And our idea is to basically use this as an anchor point for policy conversations that we're hoping to have with various policymakers and researchers and clinicians in this space. And that's, you might have this question, but that's an area of future work that I think, Tom, you and I are going to continuously collaborate on.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to that, because I think you're right. There's been, great research work done over the years on this, but how do we get it down to, one, helping the veteran, and also just the clinician too, because the clinicians are looking for what they could do differently. I would suggest, not a doctor, but I would suggest, the physical side, the treatment side of that's going to probably not change much, but how the approach maybe happens because of the person has a military mindset. Or how to make, just something as simple as getting the person to pace without them feeling like they're failing. It's just part of the process. Yeah, you're not going to lift with 50 pounds. We're going to start you at 5 pounds, but that's okay. It's part of the journey. Those kind of insights on how they can work around the military mindset. So I think, that would be a wonderful way to kind of make it more applicable, I guess is the right word I'm looking for.
Yeah. Totally. And we're going to be testing out some of these stories with a couple of different groups to see how we can really build upon this, and how we can spread it in a way that addresses some of those things that meets clinicians and researchers in the clinical room or at the start of a research project. Mm-hmm. Because it's so ingrained, I think any research that is developed on veterans and military service members needs to have some sort of basic understanding of military identity, because that, I think, underscores how they behave, how they act, how they respond. And without that lens, I think our research projects moving forward might not fully help us understand what's happening. So really, really important stuff. And I'm hoping to really get out some interesting findings and relationships as a result.
Yeah, a toolkit for clinicians on identity, mindset, and how to help veterans move through chronic pain. There we go. We got a title.
Yeah, we got a title for the next one.
Great to have you on the show. I think it'll be helpful for the audience.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I would just like to say I wanted to, of course, thank you as being part of the research team, but I'll also name all the other researchers, mm-hmm. Phoebe Priest, Leanne Lacroix, Ekemini Oku, Abinya Gulsingham, Nicholas Helt, David Pedler, and Carrie Kaluski, and of course, the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence for Canadian Veterans for funding that work.
Yeah. It was a great team. They worked very hard on this, and I think we got some excellent information out of it. So thanks again for being on the show. And for our audience, if you want feedback about the show or to learn more about chronic pain, visit our website at veteranschronicpain.ca. You can also follow us on Facebook and X at Chronic Pain COE and on Instagram at chronicpain_COE. Stay safe and keep the hope alive.
The Most Painful Podcast is produced for the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence by Story Studio Network.